This has been May with the Seek the Old Paths TV program. Thank you so much for once again being with us. I hope that you're able to follow along. You know, we are using a study guide that is called How Long, O Lord? This is the current, in fact, the last book in this series of books by Bob and Sandra Waldron. I encourage you to order your own copy. If you don't have one yet, you'll see the information on your screen. Particularly this lesson and the last lesson really illustrates some of the usefulness of this good book that we've been using, because we're talking now about the years of chaos. The years of chaos. And we're really looking at the kind of the point in time in the New Testament to where, the church was established around AD 29. And so now we are in the AD 60s. And in the AD 60s, Paul has, now you'll see it in review, I get ahead of myself, but we're looking at a point in time that Christians are going to be persecuted. But not only are Christians going to be persecuted, the Jewish people are going to be almost wiped out. At least the city of Jerusalem is in AD 70. So the 60s and then AD 70, terrible times. This is extra biblical material. It is not covered in any detail at all. The book of Revelation alludes to the persecution of Christians by the Roman government. We'll see that start under Nero, as we talked about last time. And so let's get into our study. And so you'll see that this is indeed a chaotic time. And it is one that again, the Bible itself does not go into the detail. And so let's just briefly look at some things. By the AD 60, Paul's 3 missionary journeys were over. Luke, who wrote the book of Luke and the book of Acts, he accompanied Paul on that last trip to Jerusalem and on that trip to Rome, where he would be a prisoner for 2 years. James continued his work among the Jews in Jerusalem. Peter worked in Jerusalem for a long time after the other apostles had already scattered to other places. We don't know a lot about Peter's work. The early years of the 60s proved to be the calm before the storm. Now, it would be hard to convince those early Christians of that, because the Jews were very relentless in their trying to stop Christianity. Oh, but when the Roman Empire gets involved, it takes it to a whole other level. Now, Nero was the emperor of Rome from AD 54 to AD 68. Now, remember, we're in the 60s. In AD 70, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed by the Romans. But notice Nero is going to die 2 years before that, in AD 68. But now, during Nero's reign, a terrible fire happened in Rome, and much of the city was burned. Well, Nero needed a scapegoat, so he decided that he would blame the Christians for starting the fire. And the persecution was, needless to say, a traumatic experience for the saints. Christians were arrested. Their deaths were almost farcical. They would be dressed in wild animal skins and torn to pieces by dogs, and they'd be crucified. They'd be made into human torches to light like Nero's gardens after dark. In fact, Nero provided his gardens. Yeah, we'll just use mine. And he would mingle with the crowd, Nero would, and he would stand in a chariot and dressed like a charioteer. And just, despite, as Tacitus said, Tacitus made this quote, "Despite their guilt as Christians and the ruthless punishment it deserved, the victims were pitied." The people were starting to see Nero was just using these Christians to serve his own end. It was felt that this was more about one man's brutality. Now, once Nero died in AD 68, then that stopped then, for a time, the persecution of Christians. Now, Jerusalem and the Jews are a whole nother matter. During the same years that the church was being persecuted by Nero, rebellion broke out in Judea. 2 years before Nero's death. He died in 68, so around 66. Now, the Jews, well, they were always, they never accepted Roman occupation. They always felt, we are God's city, we are God's chosen people. And they were, and they could have been, had they remained faithful. The historian Josephus is the chief source of information about the Jewish wars. The Jews, well, like I say, when they got there in 63 BC, when the Romans got there in 63 BC, the Jews never accepted being occupied like that. The Romans wanted to control the whole Mediterranean Sea, so they needed that little strip of land. We talked about that last time. Part of this is a review from the last lesson. The years between the establishment of the church in AD 29 and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 were just full of turmoil, murders, and insurrections. We take Christianity for granted. You know, at one time, the majority of people in this country would claim to be a Christian. Sadly, that number continues to dwindle. But during these years, if not for God's grace, the faithfulness of those Christians who were willing to die for their faith, maybe it could have been not what we see today, at least. I never say Christianity can be destroyed, because God's word, it'll last forever. And His will will be done. And He is still in control. Festus, now, that had a lot of governors come and go, and Festus succeeds Felix as the governor of Judea. Albinus followed Festus. Gessius Florus followed Albinus. Now, it's like they keep getting worse. In fact, this last one, Florus, made Albinus look good. He was so bad that he just about started the Jewish wars himself. And when the people heard that an army was coming, as it come down from Caesarea, they said, oh, okay, we maybe have pushed this too far. Let's send representatives out to Florus and say, let's say we would be obedient to you. He wouldn't listen to it. Didn't want to hear it. So he sends his people into the city to loot and plunder and kill. I mean, they were ruthless. They even would crucify children. Bernice, who was the sister of King Agrippa, that King Agrippa from Acts chapter 26, maybe the only good thing or the noble thing that we know that she did, she went to Florus, to the governor, and tried to intercede on the Jews' behalf. He wouldn't listen to her. In fact, threatened to kill her. He was just a ruthless person. And this is the circumstances that the Jews and the Christians were finding themselves in the area of Jerusalem. Now that brings us really to lesson 16. And so in lesson 16, and if you have your study guide, that starts on page 80. Page 80. By the way, when we finish this section of the years of chaos, we're going on to the book of Jude, just to make note of that. And so Florus, the governor, he's the governor of Judea, the area around Jerusalem. He continues to oppress the Jews until finally he tries to take the Tower of Antonia and the temple. Got some pictures of that we'll see here in just a minute. And the Jews, that was not going to happen. In fact, they destroyed the passages that connected Antonia with the temple, trying to keep this from happening. And even Florus finally thought, oh, well, maybe I'll push this too far myself. And so he leaves some soldiers behind and he goes back to Caesarea, which was good for the Jews for the moment anyway. Here are pictures of the temple area you'll see on your left, and then the Tower of Antonia. That's the tower, by the way, in Acts chapter 26, 27, where Paul was taken as a prisoner, because they would sort of overlook the temple area from that spot, and trouble would start. They'd send soldiers down from there to try to see what was going on. And so Florus, though, he does leave and he goes to Caesarea, but he sends word to his boss, who was reigning over a larger area that included Syria, That was Festus Gallus. And it says, those Jews are in revolt. Of course, he doesn't acknowledge any fault of his own. And so Gallus sent Neapolitanus to investigate. Well, Neapolitanus happens to meet King Agrippa, who, again, we read about in Acts chapter 26. And they travel together to Jerusalem. Well, the Jews, they're begging now we've got somebody beside Florus. They hated Florus. He was extremely cruel. So maybe these people will listen. And he says, look, we are not in revolt. In fact, you could take one guard with you and just walk around the city and you'll see. It's not what it's been represented to you as being. And in fact, he commended them. Oh, your fidelity to Rome, that is great. Agrippa, King Agrippa, he was just appalled by what he was learning about what Florus had done. And the Jews felt more comfortable with Agrippa than they did with Neapolitanus. This was formerly King Agrippa, again, that we read about in Acts chapter 26. But he could see the temperature was still hot. The Jews were just had about all they could take. They were in a mood to fight, and he, though distressed by their suffering, he was more distressed that they were willing to fight against Rome. Part of his job, all those leaders, the governors, and all those people, their job was to keep the peace and to maintain their loyalty to the emperor, to the Roman Empire. He thought he had talked them out of it. Didn't last long, because once he said, now here's what you need to do. You need to obey Florus. It's like, no. They just couldn't do that, or they didn't think they could. And the more rebellious of the Jews struck military targets, even killing the garrison of soldiers in Jerusalem. They kept fanning the flames of the Romans' hatred toward them, because they're just going to push so far, and the Romans are going to snap back at them, which they do. As often happens, a few hotheads seized control and drove the nation into war, and really much of the resulting suffering they brought upon themselves by the terrorists. Now, the terrorists were the Zealots, and they kept fanning the flames. They were slaughtered in many cities in Palestine as the Romans pushed back against these insurrectionists. It really got bad. Here's a map, and what we're going to see are, from history, how many thousands of Jews in various cities were going to be killed. You're going to have 20,000 in Caesarea. And there you can see on the map there, Caesarea is on the coastline there of Samaria. You're going to have 13,000 in Scythopolis. You'll have 2,500 in Ascalon, and there's Ascalon toward the bottom of your map there, and then you're going to have 2,000 in Ptolemais. And so you can see it's kind of spread out. We don't have all of those cities on there, but you can see most of them. Those are thousands upon thousands of Jews being killed because of these zealots who kept pushing back, fighting back against really a formidable Roman army. Now, they may not have all their army there at one time, and that might give the Jews some pause to think, oh, we can take them. They're going to find out, sadly, they're going to find out differently. Finally, Gallus, the governor of Syria, was forced, to do something. And so he comes with a large army to Ptolemais. And he roamed over the countryside of Galilee, trying to regain control. Agrippa, King Agrippa, remember, he's trying to show his support to the Rome because he couldn't dare do otherwise. He accompanies Ptolemais. So they come to Caesarea. Caesarea is just north of Jerusalem. He sends troops to Joppa. Now we'll see where Joppa is on the map here in just a minute. Joppa is going to be on the coast. He kills 8,400 in a surprise attack. He then sends a large army into Galilee to deal with the rebels. So this Oh, here is Joppa, as you can see there on your map, there on the coast. This is in the area of Judea. You can see also, you can see Jerusalem there. See if I can make this a little bit larger for us on the map. And so there you see Bethel, you see Jerusalem, you see Bethlehem. To the right, you see the Salt Sea. Also above the Salt Sea, you see the River Jordan. And so they're just trying to get these Jews to back down, to just squash this revolt that they've been carrying on with. And so again in Joppa, there were 8,400 that were killed. Festus moved his army to Antipatris and then to Lydda. They get to Lydda, but the city was basically empty because it was the Feast of the Tabernacle, so most of the people had traveled to Jerusalem. So as they march on toward Jerusalem, the fighting starts intensifying. They come to Jerusalem and they burned a large portion of the area known as Bethesda, which means New City. Now here is a map of the city of Jerusalem. Again, let me see if I can make this a little bit larger for us so we can see this better. And so you see Bethesda there at the top of the diagram of the city of Jerusalem. Notice in the center of it to the right, you see the temple complex. Now, so they are going to burn Bethesda, but they have not touched the temple yet. And you can see how the city is divided by various walls as well. And so they burned a large portion of that. And then they continue, of course, to attack the city. They're coming to the upper city. He was very close to winning. But unfortunately, there was some lack of harmony among his people. In fact, a large number of his cavalry officers had been corrupted by Florus, who just diverted him. And I don't know all the details of how they did that, but it got him to break off his attack on the city. He didn't realize how close he was to winning. And then the Jews themselves. Now, here the Romans were divided among themselves, but the Jews were also divided among themselves. And so some wanted to surrender to Festus. You know, they thought, we've gone far enough with this. The terrorists, though, wanted to continue the fight. Josephus says that if Festus had have continued the siege, he would have soon ended the war. Instead, he withdrew from the city and retreated by way of Beth Horon, which was the same route Jews had used when, in other times. It was a common route. And the Jews pursued the Romans. I hear the Romans are leaving. Well, the Zealots among the Jews, they're just not satisfied with that. And so they killed about 5,300 of the Roman footmen. Well, you know, this is not going to end well for them. Well, during the interim, while the Roman forces were away, a lot of the people fled the city. A lot of the prominent people fled. Do you know we read in Matthew chapter 24, and starting in verse 15, the Lord said, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of the house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight might not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days would be shortened." The Lord foretold the destruction of Jerusalem and how terrible it was going to be. Some are going to heed that. We'll see in a minute. The Christians are going to heed the warning to get out of the city when you see these things taking place. According to Eusebius, who is an early church historian, he said this: the whole body however, of the church at Jerusalem, having been commanded by a divine revelation given to men of approved piety, there before the war, removed from the city and dwelt at a certain town beyond the Jordan called Pella. So the Christians left. They had been warned by prophecy. They had been warned by the words of Jesus himself. You need to leave when you see these things start to unfold. Now, Nero, the emperor, he sends his general, Vespasian, into Judea to prosecute the war. He also had had enough of this Jewish uprising. Well, he soon arrived at Ptolemais, and this was in AD 67. Titus, his son, he gets there early spring of the next year. Well, Joppa, the main city was the main city of resistance in Galilee. It was under the command of Josephus. Now, Josephus is the historian from whom we get most of the information that I've been sharing with you. Well, that city is taken after a long siege, and Josephus, he hides for a time. He only surrendered when he was assured it'd be safe. Now, I've got some maps. We won't take a lot of time with them. It just shows in the center there Joppa, or Janapada. Hard to know sometimes how to pronounce these words. And it shows some of the movement of the Roman army sweeping through this area, trying to get these Jews under control. You can tell by this map, we don't, again, not going to spend any time much on it, but notice the topography. It's this rugged country. And so marching through and trying to get the rebels to be subdued was a difficult task. The Romans continued to take important cities throughout the country. They were determined to stop this rebellion. The situation in Jerusalem deteriorated as the more lawless elements gained the upper hand. They gained control of the temple. They appointed a man as high priest who knew nothing about being a high priest. He was not worthy of that role. And some think that it might be the taking of the temple by the terrorists that was the abomination of desolation to which Jesus referred. This was an abominable thing to do to the temple of God. Ananias, the former high priest, he said, I wish I had died before all this happened, to see God's house full of so many abominations. He provoked the crowd to attack the Zealots. So the Jews were fighting among themselves. The Zealots were Jews. We would call them terrorists today. But they were fighting against the Romans. Well, the Zealots managed to send messengers then. Once Ananias got the Jews to attack the Zealots sent for help. They called on the Idumeans. The Idumeans in the Old Testament were known as Edomites. Well, they lied to them. They made it sound like they were the ones being oppressed, when really it was not that way, it was the other way around. But they lied to them. And they gathered an army of about 20,000 to come in and rescue the Zealots. But more level-headed Jews kind of met them outside and said, no, you can't come in here. Barred them from Jerusalem. Closed the gates. Well, during a terrible storm, the Zealots used saws to open the gates. Let the Idumeans come in. And so they brought them into the city and into the temple, another desecration of the temple. About 8,500 people died there in and around the temple. Ananias, the former high priest, was also killed, among many other men of the city. But the Idumeans learned that they had been fooled, they really had been used, and they repented of that and left the city. Now, we have been quoting Josephus a lot, but stories are seldom one-sided. There are two sides to every story, as we often say. So let's notice some remarks made by F.F. Bruce about another side of this that maybe we haven't heard. And so these Zealots, were they as bad as Josephus described? So here's what he said. Far from being the godless miscreants of Josephus' account, the defenders of Masada, which is a a Jewish stronghold, were scrupulously observant Jews. Amid the splendors of Herod's palace, they installed the apparatus of worship. So here they were at Masada, diligently following the law, the Old Testament law. We shall not properly understand Josephus' bitterness against them unless we recognize that their movement cannot be explained in terms of Jewish nationalism alone. There was more to it than let's save our city, save our country. They were almost as hostile to the Jewish establishment, the hierarchy, and the wealthy aristocrats as to the Romans. And herein is Bruce's theory about this, what the problem was. He said the war of AD 66 to 73 was not only a war of independence against Rome, but also a class war within Israel. His animus against the Zealots was the sharper because he saw in their policy and activity a mortal threat to all the privileges that he and his fellow aristocrats prized. The uncovering of their last outpost at Masada has made it plain that far from being the impious criminals of Josephus' portrayal, they were men of piety, scrupulously observant of the finest details of their ancestral religion. See, the real reason, before I get to that. And so what he was saying is, what Bruce was saying in his history of this time, is that the Zealots didn't like the aristocrats. Josephus was an aristocrat, and so he felt threatened by that as well. Now, the real reason for the destruction of Jerusalem was that the Jews as a nation rejected God's Son. And he brought judgment on the city and the nation as Jesus predicted. We saw some of that in Matthew 24 already. It's also in Mark 13, Luke 17, and in chapter 21. Well, neither Josephus nor Bruce makes this point. Jesus himself rejected the methods of the Zealots, and no kind of radical piety excuses assassination and murder, though their motives may not have been as severe as Josephus describes them. Meanwhile, Vespasian, that's Nero's right-hand man, continued taking cities. Now he turns his attention to Jerusalem. He, though, hears that Nero has died. Well, that puts a delay in things. He's got to see what's going on in Rome and what's going to happen next. And so civil unrest broke out in Rome when Nero died. So now attention is being taken away somewhat from Jerusalem. From AD 68 to 69, three different men ruled. There was Galba, they ruled in Rome, in Italy, the Roman Empire. Galba was slain in the marketplace. Otho was made emperor. Well, Vitellius was proclaimed emperor by the German legion. So there was infighting within the Roman Empire. Otho led his forces against two of Vitellius' generals. Otho won the first day, but lost the next day and took his own life. Vitellius' men went to Rome and looted the city. These people, pride in country was not their motive. It was usually money and power and things like that. Matthew 24 and verse 28, the Lord said, For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. The Lord foretold all this carnage that was going on in and around the city of Jerusalem. Well, our time has quickly gotten away from us. We're almost to the end of the time of the Jewish wars. We may touch on it briefly in our next lesson, and then we're going on to talk about the book of Jude, to get into these last remaining chapters of our New Testament. Thank you so much for being with us, and as always, let's seek the old paths. I'm going to tell you about the coming of the judgment fairly well, fairly well. I'm going about the coming of the judgment fairly well.